Hey everybody, my name is Dr. Scott Giacomucci. I'm the director founder of the Phoenix Center for Experiential Trauma Therapy, which is an outpatient trauma center in Media, Pennsylvania. Today, I want to talk about trauma triggers from politics and current events, why it happens, and how we can cope with them. I thought this video was particularly timely with the new administration in the White House, and I'm seeing constantly clients and colleagues and loved ones really being emotionally activated and triggered by much of what's happening in the world right now. So I thought it would be important to make this video to shed some more light on how we can try to cope with this and to better understand if or when some of our past trauma is being triggered by current events. So as we start this conversation, it's important that we kind of clarify and differentiate the difference between being triggered by trauma and being re-traumatized. And I made a whole nother video on this. I also compared the difference between just feeling uncomfortable to being triggered or being re-traumatized. So I'm not going to cover that in detail today. I encourage you to check out the other video on this because it's a relevant topic connected to this topic. But the difference between a trigger and being re-traumatized is that when we experience something that's a trigger, it's an external stimuli or cue or action or behavior or experience that is activating and triggering something internally for us that's unresolved from the past. And the trigger itself could be just about anything. There's so many different types of nuances to the trauma we experience. And because of that, there's so many different types of nuances to the types of triggers we might experience. However, retraumatization is a bit different. Retraumatization is when we not only experience something that's triggering, but that thing that's triggering is also a new trauma and a new harm at the same time. So when it comes to the topic of politics and current events, I think not only are many people experiencing the current events as triggering, but also experiencing the current events as a re-traumatization. That many of the current events, the executive orders, the policy changes, the actions that our government is taking are not just triggering past trauma, but also causing a new trauma and at the same time activating an old trauma. So if you're constantly feeling anxious, angry, overwhelmed when watching the news or hearing about political events, you're definitely not alone. I think being triggered or re-traumatized by current events is something that happens all of the time and that we don't talk about enough. For trauma survivors, politics and current events can really activate deep emotional triggers. And it's important that we can understand when this is happening, and even more important to understand how we can try to manage these feelings, these experiences when they do happen. So there's lots of reasons why politics or current events could trigger old trauma. For one, we might feel a sense of powerlessness or a lack of control. The powerlessness we might feel over the current events and what's going on in the world and going on in our country right now might reflect and mirror some of the powerlessness or the lack of control that we felt at the time of trauma in the past. And those feelings of injustice, those feelings of being out of control, being powerless, being helpless related to what's happening in the world, what's happening in our country, could really activate and trigger the past trauma when we felt the same things. Now, the current events could also at the same time be a reminder of personal trauma. Maybe public figures or maybe the president may have certain attitudes or behaviors or dispositions or beliefs that really mimic the same attitudes and behaviors of someone who was a perpetrator of past trauma to us. I think this happens quite often with really narcissistic and authoritarian leaders. People with those types of behaviors and personalities are more likely to be perpetrators of trauma. And so when we see someone in the White House who's narcissistic, who's authoritarian, who's misogynistic, those behaviors might trigger memories of past trauma we've experienced by somebody who also demonstrated the same characteristics. Somebody who's discriminates against others based on gender or based on race or based on ethnicity might trigger memories of past people in our lives who also discriminated or oppressed us in similar ways. Now, other aspects of politics and current events that can really be a trigger for past trauma is the conflict that emerges, the disagreements, the yelling matches, the back and forth disrespect, the conflict that is happening and continues to happen may activate past memories related to trauma that had to do with conflict. For example, somebody who has experienced lots of verbal abuse and conflict in the past may be seeing people constantly in verbal disagreements and conflicts here and now about politics. And those here and now verbal disagreements and conflicts and yelling matches might really activate them emotionally because of past verbal abuse that they experience. Or somebody who has really been traumatized by rejection or abandonment might really struggle with current politics and current events, and that fear of rejection. If I disagree with somebody, if I really tell somebody how I feel or how what they're saying makes me feel, they might abandon me or reject me. And that fear of rejection, fear of abandonment may really trigger and activate memories and feelings from the past that are unresolved. Similarly, there might be really intense overload in terms of sensory overload and emotional overload related to politics and current events. The constant flood of distressing news and new executive orders and social media conflicts and negative rhetoric can really overwhelm our nervous system. Many people feel like they are walking on eggshells in every aspect of their life, that when they're at work, they have to be careful about what they say. When they're at home, when they're at a family party, when they're at a social event, when they scroll through their social media pages, when they turn the television on, that there's just a constant flood of activating information and breaking news. And it's just emotionally overwhelming, that it's overwhelmingness. I've been seeing this a lot with people, with colleagues, with friends, with families, with clients, that many people are isolating themselves from the world right now because it's too overwhelming to be in social places. It takes too much energy to constantly navigate our own emotions in relationship to other people, trying to navigate their own emotions while trying to process information about new political events and current events. And so many people are just disconnected. In the past couple months, we've had like a record number of cancellations and no shows, not just for therapy sessions, but for training events and in groups. Many people are just hyper aroused and hyper vigilant, on edge. The political events and current events can really leave us feeling unsafe in the world, especially if the new executive orders and policy changes are targeting us or our loved ones directly. It can leave us feeling like we aren't safe in our own communities anymore. We're not safe in our own country anymore. And this can really create a sense of injustice or a sense of betrayal. The corruption and dishonesty, the systematic harms and abuses can really trigger feelings of betrayal, especially for those who have experienced gaslighting in the past or any kind of institutional abuse in the past, or who were harmed or abused or betrayed by somebody in power in the past. And so what's happening in the world now and happening in the United States now, for many people, is a new harm, and at the same time can be activating old trauma, especially old trauma related to betrayal or dishonesty or abuse. Now, at the same time, we may be experiencing another type of trauma that we call vicarious trauma. And vicarious trauma is when we learn about or see or hear or witness somebody else experiencing trauma, and in doing so, we're vicariously traumatized. We experience the trauma secondhand. So this happens constantly, far more than we want to believe, because of the news, because of social media. That when we read a story on Facebook about somebody being deported, or when we read a story on the news about somebody being assaulted because of their beliefs, or when we see anti-Semitism in the news, or Islamophobia in the news, or other types of oppression or discrimination or racism or microaggressions, or people being unfairly or unjustly targeted because of their religion or their race or their gender or their pronouns, that we might experience vicarious trauma in witnessing somebody else experiencing trauma firsthand. And I think in today's age, most people's social media feed, as they're scrolling through it, there's a real risk of experiencing vicarious trauma. I know it's something I've experienced by scrolling through Instagram or scrolling through YouTube or Facebook, that I unexpectedly encounter disturbing images of somebody else experiencing harm or disturbing news about harm somebody's experiencing, and it really leaves me vicariously traumatized. So there's lots of different ways that current events, that politics could be either triggering us or even traumatizing us. And there's lots of research on this, actually. There's various research studies that have validated this phenomenon. Most of these research studies were done with the people of color, and especially the African American community, who have experienced ongoing oppression, racism, discrimination, police brutality, and that some of the research studies highlighted that when there was new news about police brutality in the community or racism, that collectively the levels of PTSD within the African American community increased during those times, which suggests that the current events were really triggering and activating PTSD symptoms for the entire community as a whole. Similarly, there's also research with the Jewish community and current events of anti-Semitism experiencing or triggering, activating past experiences of religious or ethnic discrimination. So this isn't just an idea. This is a phenomenon that's been validated through the research, that current events and politics can really trigger past trauma. And it can be really difficult to sort out, what is just discomfort about what's happening right now and disagreement. Because just because we disagree with somebody and disagree with their politics does not mean that we're being traumatized by it. So sorting out what's a disagreement versus what is a trigger. And just a trigger. Triggering something from my own past, an old trauma that I have yet to resolve and work through. And that trigger, although it can be easy to project it outward and say that the problem is the trigger out there, when we're triggered, the problem is inward. The problem is something internally that we need to address, that we need to deal with, an old trauma that we have yet to fully work through. So considering what's discomfort, what's a trigger, versus what's a re-traumatization. And this is where there's both something inward for us to heal from the past, and something outward externally that's happening in the news, that's happening in the politics, that is causing us real harm. And so sorting through, am I just uncomfortable about what's happening? Am I being triggered by what's happening? And I need to look internally and deal with what it is that's getting triggered? Or is there a real harm that's happening right now that needs to be addressed externally, while also considering what I might need to address internally? And this is difficult to sort through and navigate. Most of the time, there's probably a bit of both going on, or a bit of all of the above going on. Some discomfort, something being triggered and activated from the past, and something externally that isn't quite right that needs to be dealt with and addressed, some sort of injustice. So how do we cope with all of this? How do we cope with political and current event triggers? One thing that we can do is to set healthy boundaries about how much media and news we're consuming, how much we're exposing ourselves to the news and social media, particularly before we go to bed. If we're scrolling through Instagram and Facebook pages and groups and receiving a lot of triggers or disturbing news, it's going to impact our ability to sleep. It's going to impact what we're thinking about subconsciously before we go to bed. It's going to lead to nightmares or dreams related to current events or themes in the current events. So really being thoughtful about when we're exposing ourselves to the news. Of course, we can't just disconnect from the news, and especially if we're part of a community or we hold an identity or social membership that is really being threatened by current events. It would not be wise to entirely disconnect from the news. We need to be informed. We need to know what's going on so that we can take care of ourselves and our loved ones and our community. But At the same time, we can't be obsessed about the news. If we're constantly checking the news, constantly checking our phone, constantly scrolling to see what happened next, it's going to really leave us feeling on edge and hyper aroused and anxious and depressed. So we need to have some boundaries. Maybe we have specific times of the day that we check the news. Maybe once in the morning, once in the evening, we check the news. If there's really an emergency going on, somebody's going to call us and tell us what's going on, or we're going to get an emergency notification on our phone. So limiting, moderating our exposure to the news can really mitigate vicarious trauma and being triggered by current events. Of course, at the same time, we need to be thoughtful about which news sources we're trusting. Are we believing everything that we see on Instagram or on Facebook? Or are we taking for granted the honesty and accuracy of every news channel we're watching and every article that we're reading? Many social media platforms and news sources, maybe most, and maybe even all social media platforms and news platforms are incentivized to get more views, incentivized to get more readers. So the more dramatic their stories are, the more likely people are to watch it, to read it, and to share it. And this can really lead to exaggeration of information and really dramatizing, instilling fear when fear really doesn't need to be instilled. I really encourage you to give yourself permission to take breaks without feeling guilty about it. Of course, there's a real privilege that many people have that they really can disconnect fully and not be as threatened because of their identity, whereas other communities may feel a need to really stay connected to what's happening so that they can respond and protect themselves. And regardless of who you are, you can take breaks from the news, and you can do it without blaming yourself or feeling guilty. So another thing that can be really helpful if you're feeling really activated by current events or politics is to really work to ground yourself in the present. If we're being triggered by current events, then what that means is something from the past is being triggered. So if we can really ground ourselves in the present, it'll help soothe or reduce whatever is being triggered in the past. So there's simple things you can do for grounding. You could really anything related to the senses, sensory input or grounding. Taking a cold shower or a hot shower, deep breathing, activating your sense of smell, movement, listening to music and sound, looking around the room and finding different objects of different colors. A frozen orange is a useful tool because it gives you a different temperature sensation, a tactile sensation, the smell from the orange and the taste. So you kind of get multiple different experiences all in one. So anything you can do to ground yourself in the present, connecting with another person, talking about what's going on is another helpful thing to ground in the present. Reminding yourself of what is and what isn't in your control. So recognizing that a lot of what's going on is something that we can't immediately control. And so grounding ourselves in what is within our control. I can control my personal actions and reactions. I can control taking care of myself and the people closest to me. I can engage in activism or advocacy. I can share information. I can talk about what I believe and what I think is wrong or unjust. So shifting the focus away from what's out of our control to what is within our control can really help with a sense of empowerment, really reframing the sense of helplessness that we might feel, and instead focusing on small, meaningful actions. So rather than highlighting everything that's wrong, we might consider, well, what can I do to try to make things right? Or what small step can I take to make the world a better place, or make my community a better place, or make my life slightly better today? Maybe this involves activism or volunteering or engaging in community work or in other things that feel sustainable. This might mean supporting different causes, doing pro bono work, donations, engaging in mutual aid, providing education, or spreading awareness without burning ourselves up. So we need to really protect our energy in conversations as well. We need to remember that just because somebody is saying something that we disagree with doesn't mean we have to engage in every single argument or debate. Sometimes it's just exhausting to do that, and we might have to pick our battles. If we're constantly engaging in every disagreement with everyone we run into, we're going to be burnout. We're going to be ineffective. We're going to become irrational and depressed and irritable and angry, and it's just going to make us and our cause look even worse. So we really want to take care of ourselves, pick and choose our battles, set boundaries with people who don't engage in debate or disagreement ethically or who do so with hostility. Practice ways of setting these boundaries. Like, think about, what am I going to say to get out of this conversation or to set a boundary without abandoning myself? Maybe I'd rather not discuss this right now, but I can see that we disagree on this topic. Or I hear what you're saying, but I'm not in a place where I could engage in this conversation right now. Or it sounds like we disagree on this topic, but I don't have time to explain to you all the reasons why I disagree. Or I can appreciate your perspective on this, but I have strong feelings and beliefs that are contrary to yours. So really being able to set those boundaries in relationships help us protect ourselves emotionally too. So we need to prioritize our self-care and regulating our nervous system, that if current events and politics are triggering past trauma for us, it's really activating our nervous system. And so we need to self-soothe. We need to find activities that can help us relax and bring us joy. Maybe this is making art or hanging out with friends or watching television or being in nature or exercising. Anything we can do to calm our nervous system down will really help us also calm down the trigger that we're experiencing. Engaging in safe relationships and strengthening these relationships where conversations feel balanced and supportive. Now, these relationships are often relationships with people who share similar beliefs and feelings towards current events or politics, but they don't necessarily have to. We can have meaningful relationships where we feel safe with the other person, even in disagreeing about politics or disagreeing about current events. So disagreement does not necessarily mean a loss of safety. If it feels like we're compulsively consuming the news, maybe we need to replace that compulsion, that behavior, that time with something that's more calming, like listening to music or reading or watching television. Another thing that can be really helpful is seeking support from a trauma therapist. That if the current political events or the news is deeply affecting your mental health, your well-being, your emotions, that seeking therapy might be the solution, might be something really helpful for you. There's plenty of therapies that can help with this. Of course, therapy is focused on changing what's going on internally. It's not going to change what's happening in the world. That when there's larger social forces and political forces that are at play, causing distress and causing pain and grief and anger, we can't necessarily prevent that or fix that with therapy. Sometimes anger, grief, and despair are a perfectly healthy response to what's happening in the world and what's happening politically. But if those feelings are caused by things in the past being triggered, that's where therapy can really help. Therapy can provide us with tools to cope with these feelings and an avenue for going back and resolving, healing from some of the trauma of the past that's making it more difficult to tolerate the changes in the present. So in therapy, we can acknowledge these triggers without shame, without judgment, and understand that these are just ways that your nervous system is trying to protect you from future trauma. So political events and world issues are really overwhelming for many people. But for trauma survivors, political events and world news can hit even deeper and harder. It's okay to step back and set boundaries. It's okay to modulate how much you're being involved with the news or with activism. It's okay to protect yourself and protect your peace. So I really hope that this video provides some information specifically about when we're being triggered by current events. That, again, this is something different than if we're being harmed by current events, and really want to know what's helped you navigate the stress, the anxiety of triggers from current events or of the current events themselves. How are you coping with it? How are you navigating it? What's been helpful for you? So go ahead and put any of those helpful strategies in the comments. You might be really helping somebody else by sharing what's helped for you. And I encourage you to like the video if you found it helpful, subscribe to the channel if you want to be notified about future videos that are released.